The global memory of 1945 is one of total victory. Crowds cheer in the streets of London and New York, and a liberated Europe supposedly begins the overnight transition into a peaceful, modern democracy. For the people living in these ruins, the war didn't end with the surrender. Between 1944 and 1950, 12 million Germans were forced from their homes in a mass expulsion. Cities were 50% rebel, and hundreds of thousands of civilians were beginning to starve. Most accounts of the Second World War focus on the campaigns and the bombings that shattered the Third Reich. This story begins in the silence that followed, the period of the bitter peace. When Allied forces rolled into Germany in the spring of 1945, they arrived as occupiers with a specific mandate: keep Germany down. They were tasked with managing an entire population that, until very recently, had been the backbone of a horrific regime. This created a moral paradox that the Allies spent years trying to navigate. Does a victorious power save 70 million people, or does it punish them for the crimes of their state? For the first 2 years of the occupation, Washington's answer was punishment. In April 1945, they issued a directive known as JCS 167. It was a bureaucratic blueprint for the controlled demolition of German society. This chart shows the core logic of that policy. The directive legally capped German living standards, mandating they could not rise higher than those of the poorest neighboring country, keeping the population just above total collapse. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau wanted to push that collapse even further. He proposed a plan to strip Germany of all its industry, dismantle its factories, and flood its mines. His goal was to reduce a modern industrial power into nothing but agricultural land. While the Morgenthau Plan was never fully adopted, its spirit defined the early occupation. American soldiers were forbidden from shaking hands with civilians or sharing food. Non-fraternization rules made basic human contact a punishable offense. On the ground, the physical reality was staggering. Allied bombing had left 500 million cubic meters of rubble choking every street. With most German men dead or in prisoner of war camps, the task of clearing it fell to women. These Trümmerfrauen, or rubble women, passed bricks by hand in human chains that stretched for entire blocks. To clear that rubble, the women needed energy they didn't have. This graph shows the human survival baseline at 1,500 calories a day. Because Allied policy deliberately restricted food imports, official rations dropped to 700 calories. During the 1946 hunger winter, temperatures plunged below zero. Between the cold and calorie deficit, hundreds of thousands died. The formal economy effectively evaporated. The black market became the only way to survive, where a single cigarette could buy a loaf of bread, and a pound of butter cost more than a month's wages. These deaths were not an accident of nature. They were the result of a victorious coalition deciding that feeding its defeated enemy wasn't a priority. While the West starved, the East faced a different catastrophe. At the Potsdam Conference, the Allies agreed to what they called an orderly and humane transfer of ethnic Germans out of Eastern Europe. The reality was a violent expulsion. 12 million people were marched out of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary with only what they could carry. Up to 600,000 civilians died during these journeys from violence, disease, and starvation. As Soviet forces occupied Eastern Germany, they also committed widespread sexual violence against up to 2 million German women. These assaults were systematic, public, and largely unpunished. Victims were forced into a lifelong silence. In a society grappling with the horrors of the Nazi regime, there was no space to acknowledge German suffering without appearing to minimize German crimes. In the Western zones, the Allies attempted to judge the guilt of the entire population through mandatory questionnaires. Every adult had to answer for their activities during the Nazi era. The system quickly collapsed under its own weight. 4 million cases overwhelmed the tribunals. In 95% of cases, individuals were stamped as mere followers or cleared entirely. Germans called it the follower factory. This bureaucratic assembly line allowed the complicit to return. Judges who served under Hitler went back to the bench, and police resumed patrols. By 1947, the geopolitical map was shifting. The Allies realized that a broken, starving Germany was an open invitation for Soviet influence to spread westward. The punitive approach was abandoned. The Western Allies introduced the Deutschmark to stabilize the economy, and billions of dollars in Marshall Plan aid began to pour in. The nation that was supposed to be dismantled became the front line of the Cold War. This pivot split Germany into two nations with two opposing fictions. West Germany pursued an economic miracle built on a collective silence. Neighbors quietly agreed not to ask questions about what happened between 1933 and 1945. In the East, the German Democratic Republic claimed to be the purely anti-fascist Germany. By rejecting capitalism, they argued, their citizens were absolved of any responsibility for the past. The legacy of these years is an unresolved tension. Attempting to punish 70 million people forced an entire generation to bury their identities as both victims and perpetrators beneath a foundation of silence.